Welcome to Crime Documentary, where the darkest secrets meet the light of truth. In today's gripping story, a peaceful suburban life unravels into a chilling tale of blood, lies, and betrayal. A decorated Air Force veteran with a secret life, and a daughter whose innocence is shattered by a horrifying confession. This isn't just another mystery. It's a window into the twisted depths of the human psyche. As we peel back the layers, remember, what you see on the surface is rarely the whole story. Buckle in, because once you hear this confession, you'll never forget it. Asterisk, she thought it was just dinner, and maybe for a moment, it really was just that, a simple invitation from a father to his daughter for one last quiet summer weekend at the family's remote cabin tucked deep in the pine forests of Oregon. The kind of place where you could hear the birds at dawn and the silence at dusk. Where the world seemed to slow down just enough to forget the chaos that normally followed you back in the city. Alicia Graves had always loved the smell of that place, the way the floorboards creaked under your feet, the scent of old pine and firewood, and the memories of growing up under the watchful eye of a father she admired more than any other man in her life. Colonel Martin Graves was not just a retired Air Force hero, he was a man of discipline, a man of order and stories in honor or so. She had always believed when he called her 2 weeks ago and said he missed her, that he wanted one last weekend with her before life pulled them in different directions. She agreed almost instantly, no questions asked. He had sounded nostalgic, maybe even emotional, and that was rare for him because the Martin Graves she knew did not show emotion. He calculated it, he arranged it like the medals that still hung on the living room wall next to his folded flag. Air Force insignia, all of which were polished like trophies of a life lived by the rules. They arrived at the cabin just before sunset, the sky painted in layers of gold and purple, and Martin had already lit the fireplace and prepared her favorite meal, grilled salmon with wild rice and asparagus, the same meal he made after her college graduation and the night she got her first job as a legal assistant. She had always been proud of him more than anyone in her life. He had shaped her beliefs, her strength, her discipline. He was the man she compared all other men to, and they always came up short, even in his silence. Even when he was hard to reach or emotionally distant, she knew he loved her in his own way. She never doubted that, which is why when the wine was nearly gone and the fire had turned to embers, and her father looked into her eyes and said, "I have something I need to tell you," she smiled and leaned in, expecting maybe a confession about his health. Maybe he was ill, maybe he wanted to move closer to her, maybe he wanted to say sorry for not being around more when she was growing up. But instead he said, "9 names, 9 people are gone because of me." The words did not land at first like they should have. They floated in the air, heavy but without meaning, until he spoke again, this time slower. "I killed them, each of them, and not because I was angry or afraid, but because they needed to disappear." Alicia stared at him, mouth slightly open, unsure if this was some twisted joke, and then he began to name them one by one, first and last names, places, cities, ages, methods. Some she recognized from the news, others meant nothing at all, until he described how he met them, how they trusted him, and how he ended their lives. Each time he paused, she prayed it was over, and each time he continued, she felt a little more of her world slipping away from her, like the air was thinning, like the room was getting smaller. She could not breathe. She told herself this had to be PTSD. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he was having some kind of mental break. But then he pulled out a notebook, leather-bound and aged, and began reading from the pages. Details that were never released to the public. The position of the bodies, the way the victims were posed, the words carved into their skin, the specific music that played in the background as they died. And Alicia's heart began to race in a way she had never felt before. This was not delusion. This was detail, terrifying, accurate, gruesome detail. And he said he had kept it all locked away for years because he was waiting for the right person to confess to. And that person was her. She tried to interrupt, to change the subject, to call it a joke, to suggest they go outside for some air, but he held up one hand and said, "You need to know this before I die. You need to know who your father really is and why I did what I did." Alicia tried to look away, but something about his voice kept her rooted. It was the same voice that used to read her bedtime stories, the same voice that told her never to lie, to always do what was right. And now that voice was telling her that he had chosen to kill people as if it was part of some sacred duty. He leaned back and took a deep breath, like a man finally unburdened. And then he told her the first story. A man named Tyler Burke, age 43, a youth counselor at a church in Florida, accused of abuse, but never convicted, buried under connections and corruption. Martin met him during a church retreat one summer, pretending to be a guest speaker, and after gaining his trust, he waited until Tyler was alone and strangled him with his own belt, then left him in his car near the lake with an empty bottle of pills in his lap. Everyone thought it was suicide. Case was closed and the man was buried with sympathy and prayers, and that was the beginning. Martin said that was when he realized he could do what others could not. Alicia sat frozen, her wine glass slipping slightly from her hand, spilling red onto the carpet like blood, and still her father continued as if he were reading from a script. Like a man finally allowed to speak after years of forced silence, he told her about victim 2, corrupt judge who accepted bribes from domestic abusers. Victim 3, a school principal who covered up crimes committed by wealthy students, and so on and on, each story darker, each ending more twisted, and by the 5th victim, Alicia no longer recognized her father at all. She wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare, but he would not let her move from her seat, and deep down part of her did not want to, because she needed to know how far this went, how deep the madness ran. The wind outside had picked up and the trees were now shaking, like they too had heard the horror unfolding inside that cabin. Martin pulled out an old wooden box and placed it on the table between them, and said, "I want you to see this." And he opened it, and inside were photographs, black and white, grainy snapshots of each victim, some taken while alive, others after death, all taken by him, and catalogued with the care of a man keeping trophies. One face stood out: Dean Mayers, a family friend and neighbor, someone who had attended every holiday dinner at their home, who once gave Alicia a bike for Christmas. She gasped, and he nodded. Yes, Dean was one of them too. She wanted to ask why, but he was already answering before she could speak. He said Dean used to be a pilot who ran secret trafficking operations overseas, and that he had confessed this to Martin during a drunken night years ago, thinking it would never leave the room. But Martin never forgot, and one night he waited for Dean outside a bar, followed him to his hotel room, and made sure he never trafficked anyone again. And that was how Martin justified it all. He believed he was justice, a silent weapon sent to balance the scales, and every kill was a mission, every death a correction. Alicia began to cry, not from grief, but from terror, because the man who raised her had become a stranger, and now that stranger was telling her he had always been this way, and that the man she loved had never existed, or perhaps had been buried long ago beneath medals and uniforms and secrets. And what scared her most was not that he had killed these people, but that he believed with his entire soul that what he had done was right, and maybe even good. Martin reached for her hand, and for a moment she pulled away, but he looked into her eyes and said something she would never forget. He said, "They were just like me, Alicia. They were hiding behind masks, pretending to be something they were not. Only I never got caught, only I never stopped. I am still who I always was. And now, you know, the fire was dead, and the room had gone cold, and Alicia felt like she had stepped outside of time, like she was watching a movie play out, and the screen had cracked and spilled into her real life. She stood slowly and backed away toward the door, but he made no move to stop her. He simply nodded and said, "You can leave if you want, or you can stay and let me finish the story, because there is more, much more, and once it is all out, I can finally rest." She did not answer, not at first, because her voice was gone, replaced by a scream that never reached her lips. She stepped outside into the night, where the stars had vanished and only the wind remained howling through the trees like a warning, and deep in her chest, she knew the truth had already changed everything. And there was no going back from this confession, no pretending she had not heard what she heard, and no unseeing the face of her father turned killer, and perhaps worst of all, knowing that this story, this horror, this legacy now lived in her blood. 2. And that was the moment she realized the weekend had only just begun. Alicia stood in the cold air outside the cabin, her fingers numb, her thoughts spinning, her body unmoving, even as her heart beat faster than it ever had, before the trees loomed over her, like shadows of giants, and every sound in the forest made her flinch like the earth itself was alive and watching. She had grown up admiring this place, loving it, associating it with warmth and family and peace, but now it felt like the ground beneath her feet had changed, like she was no longer on familiar soil but trapped in a twisted version of her own childhood, one where nothing was real and everything she believed had been an illusion. Built on blood, her father was still inside the cabin, likely sipping the last of the wine, maybe preparing to tell her about the next victim, or maybe just waiting to see if she would run or stay, because the way he looked at her before she left the room was not threatening, it was calm, certain, like he had expected this moment for years and had accepted that she would either carry his truth or bury it. She wanted to scream, but the scream would not come. She wanted to cry, but the tears had stopped, because something inside her was now locked between horror and disbelief, between the need to protect the man who raised her and the urge to expose the monster he had become. She turned back to the cabin door, opened it. Slowly, the warmth of the fireplace hitting her like a wave of lies. Her father was sitting exactly where she left him, notebook open, pen in hand, the box of photographs now neatly closed and set aside. As if this were all just another family discussion, as if nothing he had told her had shattered her soul, he looked up at her and smiled, the same smile he gave her at high school graduation, the same smile he wore when he taught her how to ride a bike, and now that smile felt like a mask that had been hiding something too terrible to name. He said, "I knew you would come back. I knew you needed a minute to breathe, and I understand. It is a lot to take in, but I am not finished, not yet, and you need to hear it all before you decide what to do, because once you know everything, you will see why I did it, and why it had to be done." Alicia sat down without speaking, her hands folded tight, her fingernails digging into her palms. He continued, "Victim 6, a military chaplain who had used his position to prey on soldiers under his care. Martin said he had met him during a veteran support group and listened as the man spoke about God and healing while hiding the truth of what he had done to young soldiers desperate for help. Martin said he followed him home, waited outside his church for days, and one night followed him into the chapel, where he confronted him with everything he knew and gave him a choice: confess or disappear. The man laughed, and that was the end of him. The stories continued, each one more detailed, each one a puzzle piece in a dark masterpiece that had been crafted over decades, and with every victim, Alicia felt her stomach turn, not just from the horror of their deaths, but from the conviction in her father's voice. He was not confessing with guilt, he was explaining with pride, like he believed he had done what no law enforcement agency had the courage to do, to purge the world of hidden evil, one person at a time. And then he paused, reached into his suitcase, and pulled out a set of documents. Printouts, photographs, and maps. He laid them out like an investigator briefing a partner, and said, "I want you to see something, patterns that no one ever noticed. But I did, connections that no one ever followed, but I did, and now I am showing them to you because you are the only one who will understand." Alicia looked at the files, trying not to touch them, but unable to stop her eyes from reading the names, the dates, the locations, all across the country, spanning 25 years, from coast to coast, victims from every walk of life, and yet all linked by secrets, crimes they had covered up or committed and gotten away with. And somehow Martin had known, and somehow Martin had found them, and somehow Martin had killed them, and no one ever connected the dots until this night. And that was when Alicia realized something else. Something that chilled her even more than the murders. Her father had not just been lucky, he had been methodical. He had been careful, he had been brilliant, and that made him even more dangerous. She asked him how he had found these people, how he had known what they had done, and he smiled again, and said the same way anyone else finds the truth, by listening, by watching, by pretending to be someone they can trust. I used my charm, my background, my uniform, my history. I wore a face they wanted to believe I was, and then I let them reveal who they really were. And once I knew, I acted. Alicia stared at the man before her, the man who had once tucked her into bed and taught her how to throw a football and fixed her first flat tire, and now that same man was telling her he had used those same skills to end lives and to erase people from the earth. And it would have been easier to dismiss it all as madness if not for the evidence, the photographs, the notes, the accuracy of it all, because this was not the delusion of a madman, this was the precision of a predator. And now she was the one holding the truth, the one who could either stay silent or speak her thoughts. Spiraled until Martin said something that made her heart stop. He said, "They were just like me, only I never got caught." And she looked at him confused, horrified, and asked, "What do you mean?" And he leaned forward, eyes locked with hers, and said, "I was like them, Alicia. I had secrets too. I lived a life no one knew about. And if they had, I would have been on someone else's list, but I was smarter. I learned how to hide it. I learned how to control it, and eventually, I learned how to use it." And then he opened another file, this one marked personal, and handed her a photograph, and the man in the picture looked familiar, but she could not place him until she looked again and realized it was her father, only younger, in a tuxedo, standing beside another man in a hotel room, and then another photograph and another, each one more revealing, more intimate, more confusing. And finally she asked him, "What is this?" And he answered, "I was an escort after I retired from the military. I needed money, and I needed something else, something I could not find in the life I had built. And so I started meeting clients, men who paid well and asked no questions, and for years that was my secret." Alicia could barely speak, her mind breaking into pieces as the truth poured out of his mouth like poison. Dressed in logic, he told her about the clients, the hotels, the arrangements, the way he was careful to never get attached and never stay too long. And then he told her something else, something that made her physically sick. "Many of those clients are dead, now not because of me, not all of them at least, but some, yes, the ones who crossed a line, the ones who confessed something they should not have, the ones who bragged about crimes like trophies while sipping champagne. Those were the ones I ended, because they were already guilty, and I was already broken enough to do it." She stood up again, shaking, unable to stay, still unable to breathe. She walked outside again into the dark, where the sky had no stars and the forest no song. Her thoughts now fractured her soul, screaming, her heart aching, because the man who raised her, the man who said bedtime prayers with her and taught her to believe in justice, had become his own judge, jury, and executioner. And now he had passed that weight onto her, like a torch passed in secret, like a sin shared between blood. She could hear him moving inside the cabin, calmly pouring another drink, maybe preparing the next confession, maybe waiting for her to come back, maybe knowing she would, because the truth had already wrapped around her like chains, and even if she ran, she would never escape. It never forget. It never untangle herself from the knowledge that her father was not the man she thought he was, and that somehow she had always sensed something was off, but never wanted to see it, never dared to look too closely. And now that she had, it was too late. She paced the dirt path near the cabin, hands in fists, her breath visible in the cold air, and then her phone vibrated, a message from her coworker, a joke, something casual and light. And in that moment, she realized how far from normal she now stood, how distant the world had become, because nothing was funny. Now nothing was casual. Now everything was split into before and after. Before the confession and after the confession, before the murder and after the revelation, before the lie and after the silence was broken. She went back inside once more, and her father looked at her as if they were having coffee and not unraveling decades of darkness. And he said, "I know this is hard. I know you probably hate me, but I need you to hear the rest, and once I tell you, then I will be done. Then you can decide what to do, and I will not stop you. I will not run. I will not hide, because I trust you, and because I always knew this day would come." And that was when she realized something that chilled her deeper than anything else. She had seen or heard that night. He had planned this. He had chosen her for this moment, not because he was losing control, but because he had finally gained enough of it to hand over the truth. And in his twisted mind, this was love, this was trust, this was legacy, and now she had to carry it, or destroy it, and she did not know which was worse. The fire crackled, the night grew colder, and inside the cabin a father and daughter sat in silence, one with blood on his hands and peace in his eyes, and the other with fear in her heart, and a future she no longer recognized, and somewhere out there in the world, the families of those 9 victims still searched for answers, not knowing that the answers were sitting in a cabin deep in the woods, held tight between the pages of a notebook and the eyes of a woman who could no longer pretend that her life was what it once was. And outside, the wind began to rise again, whispering through the trees like a voice from beyond, warning, or weeping, or simply reminding the world that nothing stays buried forever, not even the truth, not even the past, not even a father's sins told in quiet, whispers beneath the crackle of a dying fire. The sun never rose for Alicia that morning, not really, not in any way that mattered even. When light broke over the pine trees and birds sang the usual songs of the Oregon forest, the world seemed dull, like someone had turned down the brightness of her life and smeared the edges of her vision. She sat on the wooden steps of the cabin, her hair tangled, her face blank, her phone dead, and the man who raised her just inside those walls, packing more truths into pages that felt like weapons. Her mind had not stopped racing, not since the words "male escort" left her father's lips, not since he showed her the photographs, not since the confession blurred into madness, and the madness blurred into something even worse, something methodical, something cold, something absolute. She had seen a lifetime in his eyes the night before, and none of it matched the story. She had believed her entire life he had been a hero, a patriot, a man who stood for truth and justice, who saluted flags and honored vows and lived a life of discipline and silence. And now she knew the silence was not peace, it was concealment. It was the cage that held his darkness tight until it no longer could, and now that cage had opened, and it was spilling, and she was covered in it. When she finally stepped inside again, the smell of coffee hit her like a strange reminder that some things were still normal, even in a house of nightmares. Her father stood at the stove, humming, softly pouring 2 cups as if they were sharing breakfast, as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just changed her world forever. He handed her a mug and sat across from her with that same patient expression, the same eyes that once watched over her first day of school and now waited for her to digest the weight of his truth. She did not speak, and he did not rush her. He simply sipped and waited, and then without invitation, he began again, not with a new victim, not with a new story, but with a memory, a story from before the murders, before the escort life, before the military. He spoke of his own childhood, a place filled with silence and discipline, a father who broke things more than he fixed them, and a mother who faded into the wallpaper. Long before she died, he said he had learned early that masks were survival and performance was protection, and somewhere in the performance he began to believe it was all real, until he could not remember which version of himself was true. Alicia listened because part of her wanted to understand, not excuse, not forgive, but understand the fracture, the break, the first crack in the mirror of the man she had known her entire life. He told her about his first deployment, the first time he held a dying man in his arms, the first time he saw the gap between law and justice, between punishment and truth. And he said it was then that something inside him shifted, something he never told anyone, not even her mother. And when he came home from war, he wore the face everyone wanted. The hero, the survivor, the role model. But inside, the war had never stopped, and it had given him a compass that no longer pointed north, it pointed toward silence, toward judgment, toward action. He told her the military had taught him how to listen, how to follow, how to obey, and eventually how to manipulate. And when he retired, the world felt too loud, too soft, too unstructured, so he found control in places No one looked in dark corners of power and secret desires of powerful men, in rooms where rules bent and masks fell, and he became someone else, someone who knew how to make others talk, and then how to make them disappear. Alicia's hands tightened around her coffee mug. Her knuckles white, her jaw clenched. She wanted to scream still, but no sound came, only questions. Why did you keep it? Why me? Why now? And as if reading her mind, he said, I kept it all because I needed someone to see it, not just know it, but truly see it. I needed you because you are the only person I have ever trusted. To look and not turn away. And now that you know, I can finally be free, not just from the lies, but from the waiting, because every day I woke up wondering if this would be the day it all ended, if the knock would come, or the news would break, or your eyes would see through me. And now that moment has come, and I do not have to run anymore. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she would never understand, that she would never accept it. But part of her knew he was right about one thing. She had always looked at him differently, always expected something more, always sensed there was a locked door inside him, and now it had opened, and what stood behind it was terrifying, but it was real, and the worst part was how easily he moved through it, how easily he told the stories, how easily he remembered every detail, every name, every face. He reached for another folder, this one thicker than the rest. And he said, this is everything, the records, the maps, the names, the timelines, every person I met, every crime I discovered, every kill I carried out. It is all here, and it is yours. Now you can do what you want, burn it, take it to the police, bury it, or use it. I will not stop you, I will not beg. I just needed someone else to hold the weight for a moment, because I am tired, and I am ready, and I know what comes next. Alicia took the folder in her hands and felt the weight of it, not just the paper, but the years, the lives, the stories, the blood, and she opened it slowly, each page more horrifying than the last, and still she read, because part of her needed to see the full picture, needed to know exactly who her father had become. And as she read, she began to notice something else, a pattern, not just in the victims, but in the rhythm of the kills, the timing, the structure. It was like reading a script or following a code, and that was when she asked him, how did you decide when to act and when to walk away? And he answered, I never walked away, not once. Once I knew I acted, always. It was never random, never emotional. It was precise, and it was just. She closed the folder and stood up again, unable to sit in the same room as him any longer, her thoughts now loud and jumbled, her pulse pounding, and she walked into the back room, the one he used as a study, and there she found more notebooks, more photographs, a drawer full of flash drives, all labeled, all organized, and it hit her again, how deep this went, how long he had been doing this, how many layers of planning had gone into every single decision. And as she picked up one of the flash drives, she saw a label that made her knees weaken. It read Alicia 2014, and she remembered that year. She had nearly married a man named Darren, who had broken her heart with lies and cheating. And she wondered for one terrifying moment if her father had acted then too. She rushed back into the main room, holding the flash drive, and asked him, what is this? And he looked at her with a softness that somehow made it worse, and said, I watched him, I listened, I waited, but I did not act. He was not evil, just weak, and weakness is not a crime. Not yet, at least. And that was when she realized he had been watching her life, not just as a father, but as a predator protecting his own, not out of love but out of obsession. She dropped the flash drive onto the floor, like it burned, and backed away from him, her breath shallow, her mind racing, because this was not just a confession. It was surveillance, it was control, it was a life lived in shadows and reflected in her without her ever knowing. And now she had to ask herself something she had never imagined was possible. Was she still herself, or had she been shaped by him all along? Had his choices bled into hers? Had his judgment infected her thinking? Had she inherited more than his eyes and his voice? Had she inherited the part of him that could listen and see and judge and act? Her father stood and walked past her toward the back of the cabin and said, there is one last thing you need to see before this is over. And she followed, not because she trusted him, but because she had come too far to stop now. And he opened a locked door, one she had never noticed before, and inside was a room colder than the rest, lined with steel. Shelves and lined with more boxes, more files, and one wall covered in newspaper clippings, photographs, and maps. And in the center of the wall, a photograph of himself younger in uniform, and below it the word justice written in thick black ink. "This is where I planned it all," he said. "This is where I became who I am, and now it is yours. Do what you must, Alicia. But know this, I never lied to you. I never hurt you. I never stopped loving you, and everything I did because someone had to, because the system failed, and I would not." She turned away, unable to look at the wall any longer, her stomach sick, her hands shaking, and she knew now that this story would never leave her, never stop echoing in her head, and the question would follow her forever. What do you do when the man you love becomes the man the world fears? What do you do when the truth is too heavy to carry and too dangerous to leave behind? And what do you do when the one person who trusted you with his final breath is the same person the world would demand you destroy? She walked outside again, this time not to escape, but to think, and the sky above her was blue and endless and uncaring, and the wind whispered through the trees, and in that moment, she knew she stood at a crossroad. One path led to silence and shadows, the other to exposure and consequences, and whichever path she chose, her life would never be the same. Behind her the cabin waited, and inside her father waited, and in her hands the truth pulsed like a heartbeat that would never stop. The truth had become its own living thing, breathing beside her, whispering inside her, wrapping around her like fog. It moved with her every step, every breath, every blink of her eyes. It watched her from the trees, it echoed from the floorboards of the cabin. It pulsed in her ears, louder than her heartbeat and heavier than her bones. And yet she did not cry, not anymore. The tears had dried like old blood, leaving only the stain, only the weight, only the mark of something that would never be unseen, never be unheard, never be undone. And now the question loomed before her, vast and brutal. What was she supposed to do with it? Her father slept soundly in the room behind her, or maybe he was pretending to sleep. Maybe he was waiting to see what she would do. Maybe he had planned this entire moment, like he planned his kills with detail and purpose, and the precision of a soldier turned executioner. She looked down at the folder in her lap, the names, the dates, the maps, the photographs, the details carved into the pages like scars into skin, each one a life ended, and each one a reason offered. She wanted to burn it all, to throw it into the fireplace and watch the flames erase every truth, every memory, every image. But something in her stopped her, something deep, something cold, something familiar. She stood and walked slowly through the cabin, her hands trailing the walls that had once held her childhood. The pictures still hung in the hallway, one of her as a baby in his arms, one of her mother smiling beneath the mountain sun, a house filled with lies but still filled with love. And it was that contradiction that broke her, the knowledge that love and horror could live in the same house, in the same person, in the same story, and she did not know if that made it more human or more monstrous. She found his phone on the counter, unlocked, open, as if left there on purpose, as if inviting her to search, and she did because she needed to know what else he had hidden, what else he had planned. And in the messages she found threads of lives tangled together, military contacts, old clients, encrypted names, numbers, locations, and more than anything, a pattern, a rhythm to everything he had done, as if he were following steps in a song only he could hear. And in his notes she found something else, a letter addressed to her, written months ago, maybe longer, maybe years. It read, "If you are reading this, then I have told you everything or enough of it, and I want you to know that I never regretted saving those lives, even if it meant ending others. I want you to know that I always loved you, and that my last breath belongs to you, and I want you to decide if I deserve peace or punishment." She stared at the screen for a long time, the words not moving, the light flickering against her skin, and in that moment she realized her father had not only confessed to her, he had chosen her as judge, jury, and executioner. And that was not love, that was something else. Something cruel, something manipulative, because love does not place this weight on another soul. Love does not ask a daughter to decide if her father lives or dies. If his name is remembered in silence or buried in infamy, she took the flash drives, the notebooks, the folder, and packed them into her bag, her hands moving on their own. Her mind somewhere between numbness and fire, she stepped outside again, into the cold air, the sky above. Her still blank, still uncaring, the trees swaying gently. Like spectators waiting for the end of a play they had seen too many times, she got into her car and drove with no destination. Just movement, just escape, the tires crunching over gravel like bones, the road stretching ahead like a question with no answer. She drove until the trees disappeared, until the sky turned gray, until the first radio station buzzed to life, and then she pulled into a gas station, her hands shaking as she paid the clerk, her eyes searching every face like they might already know the truth, like it was written on her forehead, like the ghosts of the dead followed her now, whispering justice or revenge or maybe just helping. The bathroom, she stared at her reflection for a long time. The woman in the mirror was not the same one who arrived at the cabin days ago. That woman was gone, and in her place stood someone else, someone older, someone hollow, someone filled with something she could not name. And when she finally looked away, she saw the headline on the small TV near the ceiling: missing man from Oregon, last seen near National Forest, family fears, foul play, and the face on the screen was one of the photographs in her folder, one of her father's victims. The world was already asking questions, the world was already knocking at the door of the past, and she held the key to open it wide or keep it locked forever. She got back into the car and drove again, this time with direction, this time with choice. This time with the truth in the passenger seat, and the weight of it pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. She arrived at the federal building just before nightfall, the windows glowing, the guards watching her as she stepped inside, her bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes steady, her voice calm when she asked for someone in homicide. She was led to a small room with a cold table and warm lights, and she placed the bag on the table and said nothing for a long time. Until someone asked her, "What do you have?" and she opened the folder and said, "I have everything." And when they asked who gave it to her, she said, "My father." And when they asked where he was, she said, "I do not know." And that was the first lie, because she knew exactly where he was, or at least where she had left him. The agents read the pages slowly, their eyes widening, their hands tightening around pens and phones. And within an hour, the room was filled with people, voices, rising commands, shouted, questions fired, and all she could do was sit and wait and wonder if this was justice or betrayal, if this was courage or cowardice, if this was what he had truly wanted, or if this was her revenge. Raid team moved in before dawn, helicopters above, boots on dirt, silence between trees, and when they breached the cabin, he was not there, the bed untouched, the fireplace cold, the notebooks gone, and only one thing left. A photograph on the table of Alicia sleeping in her childhood room, and on the back, the words, "Not you, never you," written in her father's hand. They searched the woods for days, bloodhounds, helicopters, drones, but he was gone, vanished like smoke, like memory, like a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to disappear. And now the story was everywhere, the news, the internet, the whispers in grocery stores. A war hero turned ghost, a daughter turned witness, a trail of bodies behind them, and a question that would never be answered. Some said he died in the forest. Others said he escaped to another country. Others believed he never existed at all, just a legend, just a shadow, just a story told in quiet voices when the wind howls at night. But Alicia knew better. She knew he was real. She knew he was out there somewhere, watching, listening, waiting, and sometimes at night, when the wind is just right, she hears a knock that never comes and wonders if he is near, if he is proud, if he is disappointed, or if he is finally free. And now she carries the truth alone, her name forever tied to his, her face forever printed beside his story, and she speaks of him only in dreams, and only when no one is listening. And she keeps the last photograph hidden in a box beneath her bed, because some memories are not meant to be buried or spoken, some are meant to be survived. And that is how the story ends, not with a trial, not with a bullet, not with a scream, but with silence, with mystery, with a daughter who wanted dinner and got the devil instead, with a truth too sharp to swallow and too cruel to forget, with a man who thought he was justice, and a girl who became the final witness to a life no one ever truly knew.